The world as the 90 survivors once knew it had crumbled. An unknown virus, capable of reanimating the dead, had swiftly spread across the globe. Within weeks, cities fell, and chaos overtook civilization. Governments collapsed, and people were left to fend for themselves in a world now ruled by the undead. But in the ruins of a broken world, a small group of 90 survivors had formed an unlikely sanctuary, a last bastion of hope in a zombie-infested wasteland. Among them was Sarah, a former military strategist, and Daniel, a tech expert with a knack for building defensive systems. Together, they had managed to hold their group together through sheer determination. The survivors weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for a future. The sanctuary was located in the heart of an abandoned city, surrounded by miles of destroyed infrastructure and ever-increasing hordes of zombies. For months, this safe zone had withstood attack after attack, but the undead were relentless. Every day was a battle of wits and survival. At dawn on the 157th day since the outbreak, the group's mood was tense. Sarah paced back and forth in the command center, a makeshift area set up in the underground parking lot of a former shopping mall. She scanned the monitors, eyes narrowing as she observed the large clusters of zombies closing in. It was the first time in weeks that their defenses were seriously tested. Daniel was hunched over a console in the corner, typing furiously. His fingers danced over the keyboard, rerouting power to different areas of the complex. "They're getting closer," he said, his voice tight with urgency. Sarah sighed. "We've been lucky so far, but luck doesn't last forever. We need a plan." "We need to do more than just survive," Daniel replied, looking up. "We need to strike back." The group's philosophy had always been one of defense, but as the undead continued to evolve and adapt, it was clear that a new approach was necessary. The zombies weren't mindless anymore. They had developed an eerie level of coordination, and their numbers seemed to be growing exponentially. Sarah knew that with every day that passed, their chances of making it out of the city grew slimmer. She couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep up the fight. With a deep breath, she turned to face the group assembled in the command center, fellow survivors who had become more like family over time. One by one, they shared their plans, hoping to find a solution that would guarantee their safety and give them a fighting chance at a future. It was clear that the time for mere survival was over. They needed to take the fight to the zombies. But how? "I've been working on something," Daniel said after a long pause. "If we can take out the main horde at the city's outskirts, we might be able to create a buffer zone, a safe space for the group to move." The room fell silent as Sarah's eyes flicked to the map on the wall. It was a detailed layout of the city, with areas marked in red indicating zombie hotspots. If they were to take on the main horde, they would have to move through a maze of abandoned streets, risk running into roving bands of zombies, and possibly draw attention from even more clusters. But it wasn't just the horde they had to worry about. The survivors were beginning to question whether some of their fellow group members were as loyal as they seemed. In a world so brutal and unforgiving, it was only a matter of time before trust began to erode. "Are you sure this is the only way?" Sarah asked. Her voice was steady, but there was a trace of doubt. Daniel nodded, his expression resolute. "We've done everything we can to survive. Now we fight for a future." With the decision made, the survivors began preparations. Each member of the group had their role. Weapons were checked and rechecked. Supplies were loaded into trucks and jeeps. A convoy was set up to transport the group to the city's outskirts, where they would face the zombies head-on. Despite their preparation, fear lingered. There was no guarantee they would make it out alive. The zombies were everywhere, and their numbers seemed endless. Yet, the survivors were determined. They had survived this long through strength, strategy, and sheer willpower. But this time, they wouldn't just be running, they would be fighting back. As Sarah watched the team ready themselves for the journey ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that something larger than the zombies themselves was waiting in the shadows. But for now, all they could do was move forward. The convoy set out as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouded sky. The survivors drove through the streets of the forsaken city, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they might never return. But they knew one thing for sure: the zombies didn't stand a chance. This wasn't just about survival. It was about hope. Hope that they could defeat the undead, rebuild, and make it out alive. With 90 survivors and the will to fight, they had a chance. And they were going to take it. As the convoy of survivors made its way through the wrecked streets of the city, an eerie silence settled over them. The world outside the convoy was nothing but ruins, burned-out cars, abandoned buildings, and the occasional shadow of a zombie lurking in the distance. The hum of the engines and the soft whispers of the survivors were the only sounds breaking the stillness. Sarah kept her eyes on the road ahead, the weight of her responsibility pressing on her shoulders. Every decision she made now would affect not only her survival but that of the 89 other survivors in the convoy. She glanced at Daniel, who was in the lead vehicle, furiously typing on a laptop to monitor their progress and keep track of any changes in the undead activity. The map on his screen showed their route through the abandoned city streets, highlighted by the dark red zones indicating areas overrun with zombies. "How much farther?" Sarah asked over the radio, her voice steady but laced with the tension of the moment. "About 5 miles, Daniel replied, his voice crackling through the static. "We need to stay sharp. There's a large horde near the north entrance to the city, but we might be able to bypass them if we stick to the east side." The convoy was moving cautiously, keeping to the less traveled streets, hoping to avoid detection. The undead had become more aggressive, and their heightened intelligence meant that even the slightest noise or movement could draw them in. Their senses seemed to be sharper than ever, and the survivors knew that silence was their best defense. "Everyone, keep your eyes open," Sarah said, her voice coming through the convoy's speakers. "If we see anything moving, don't engage unless we have to." As they neared the outskirts of the city, a sense of unease washed over the group. The towering skyscrapers had given way to lower, crumbling buildings, and the streets were narrower. But it wasn't the buildings that had the survivors on edge, it was the faint sounds of groaning and the occasional shuffling that echoed from the distance. The convoy slowed as they approached a set of collapsed overpasses that once connected the city to the highway. The broken concrete was now a hazardous maze of debris, and the survivors had to carefully navigate through it, avoiding both the wreckage and the zombies that roamed the area. Sarah's heart raced. She had heard stories from other survivors about these areas, where the undead seemed to gather in greater numbers, their eyes lifeless but always on the hunt. The closer they got to the heart of the wasteland, the more palpable the danger became. "Hold up," Daniel called out, his voice tense. He had spotted movement on his screen. "We've got a group of zombies ahead. They're not too close, but we don't want to risk getting spotted." The convoy halted, and Sarah ordered everyone to turn off their engines. For a moment, the only sound was the rustling of the wind as the survivors sat in silence, waiting and watching. Through the cracked windows, Sarah could just make out the figures of the undead in the distance. They were sluggish, yet there were far too many of them for the survivors to take on in a direct confrontation. "Can we get around them?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice low. Daniel studied the map. "It's tight, but there's a narrow alley on the left side. It should give us enough cover to slip past them." The survivors exchanged nervous glances. Every step forward was a gamble. There was no room for error, and the risk of drawing attention to themselves was high. But they had no choice. They had come too far to turn back now. "All right, let's do it," Sarah ordered, her voice firm. "Stay close, keep quiet, and move fast." The convoy shifted into gear, inching its way toward the alley. The survivors had trained for moments like this, but nothing could truly prepare them for the heart-stopping fear of seeing those undead figures slowly turning their way. With every passing second, it felt as though the zombies could sense their presence. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly, and Sarah could feel the tension building in the air. As they made their way through the narrow passage, the smell of decay became overpowering. The survivors held their breath, their movements deliberate and controlled, trying not to make a sound. The alley was littered with debris, making it difficult to move quickly. One wrong step, and they could easily draw the attention of the zombies. Then, just as the last vehicle was halfway through the alley, a loud crash echoed from behind them. "Shit!" someone shouted, and Sarah's heart sank. One of the trucks had knocked over a pile of debris, sending a loud rattle through the air. The sound reverberated off the walls, bouncing into the streets where the zombies roamed. The undead turned, their eyes locking onto the noise. They began to shuffle toward the alley, drawn by the sound of fresh prey. "Go! Go! Go!" Sarah shouted, slamming her foot on the gas pedal. The convoy accelerated, rushing through the alley as fast as possible. Behind them, the zombies followed, groaning and stumbling as they tried to catch up. The survivors sped down the alley, hearts pounding in their chests. Sarah's mind raced, calculating the best way to get the convoy to safety. If they could just make it through this stretch of city, they might be able to reach the outskirts, where the large horde they planned to confront awaited them. As they reached the end of the alley, Sarah took one last look in the rearview mirror. The zombies were still coming, but the convoy had a head start. For now, they had made it out alive, but they knew this was only the beginning of their journey. The convoy continued its journey, the adrenaline from their close call still coursing through the survivors' veins. The zombies, though relentless, had been left behind in the maze of alleyways. The survivors took a brief moment to breathe, grateful for the precious seconds they'd gained, but there was no time for rest. They had to push on. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the abandoned streets. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a constant reminder of the world they now inhabited. Sarah, sitting in the lead vehicle, kept her hands firmly on the wheel, but her mind was racing. She knew that even though they had escaped the immediate danger, it was only temporary. The real challenge lay ahead. She glanced at Daniel, who was sitting next to her, his eyes scanning the map intently. "How much farther to the outskirts?" she asked, trying to steady her nerves. "Maybe another 4 miles, Daniel replied without looking up, his tone tense. "But we'll have to cross through the old industrial district first. It's a dicey area, lots of narrow streets, and the zombies tend to cluster there." Sarah's gaze shifted to the rearview mirror, where the convoy stretched out behind her. Each vehicle was filled with survivors, their faces reflecting a mix of exhaustion and determination. This group wasn't just a ragtag bunch of strangers anymore. They had become a family bound by survival and the shared hope that they could defeat the undead and rebuild their world. "All right," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the silence. "We keep moving forward. Stay sharp, everyone. And remember, we don't take chances. If things go south, we pull back immediately." The convoy resumed its slow, careful progress, winding its way through the crumbling remnants of the city. As they neared the industrial district, the sounds of distant groaning grew louder, like an ominous warning. The survivors were walking into a hornet's nest, and they all knew it. The old district was a maze of factories, warehouses, and towering smokestacks. The streets were narrow, with high buildings pressing in on both sides. The shadows seemed darker here, the air heavier, as if the very ground they walked on was soaked with the despair of the past. It was the perfect place for the undead to gather, confined spaces where they could move in clusters, making it difficult for the survivors to evade them. "Remember the plan," Sarah reminded everyone over the radio. "We move fast, we stay quiet. No mistakes." As they entered the district, the convoy's pace slowed to a crawl. Every survivor's senses were on high alert, their eyes darting from side to side, scanning the darkened corners of the street. Sarah's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she spotted the first signs of trouble, a few zombies stumbling aimlessly through a side alley, oblivious to the convoy's presence. They were the lucky ones, they hadn't been noticed yet. But as they ventured deeper into the industrial wasteland, the number of zombies began to grow. Figures shuffled in the shadows, emerging from between the crumbling buildings like grotesque marionettes. The survivors kept their distance, trying not to draw attention. But the closer they got to the heart of the district, the more the undead seemed to gather, drawn together by the same instinct that had kept them going since the outbreak: hunger. "Too many," Daniel muttered under his breath, his fingers tapping nervously on the laptop. He was monitoring the zombie clusters on the map, trying to predict where the horde would move next. "If we don't pick up the pace, we'll be boxed in." Sarah's mind raced as she evaluated their options. They couldn't afford to get stuck here. Not with the main horde waiting just outside the city. Their mission was to strike at the heart of the undead, but they couldn't do it if they were surrounded. "Is there another route?" she asked, her voice sharp. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "There's a freight yard up ahead. It's a risk, but if we cut through it, we might be able to bypass the worst of the horde. It's a straight shot to the outskirts from there." "Do it," Sarah ordered. "We don't have a choice." The convoy turned sharply, veering off the main road and onto a narrow path that led toward the freight yard. As they neared the gates, the survivors could see the wreckage of abandoned trains, their rusted cars twisted and scattered along the tracks. The yard was eerily quiet, but the survivors knew better than to trust silence. It was only a matter of time before the undead found them. "We've got company," Daniel said suddenly, his voice laced with alarm. He had spotted something on his screen, a group of zombies converging on their position from the opposite side of the yard. "We'll be surrounded if we stay here too long," Sarah said, the urgency in her tone rising. "We need to move now." But just as she was about to give the order to accelerate, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the freight yard. The first of the zombies appeared, shuffling out from behind a train car. Then another. And another. The survivors' worst fear had come true. The undead were closing in, and the path to escape was becoming narrower by the second. "Go! Now!" Sarah shouted, slamming her foot on the gas pedal. The convoy surged forward, racing through the yard as the zombies began to follow, their gurgling moans growing louder with each passing moment. Sarah's pulse raced as the gap between them and the undead began to close. They couldn't afford to slow down. As the convoy barreled through the yard, Sarah's eyes darted back and forth, scanning for an escape. They had to make it through the yard and out into the open before the zombies could trap them. With every moment that passed, their chances of getting out alive diminished. But even as the survivors pushed forward, there was a growing sense of dread. No matter how fast they drove, the zombies were always one step behind. And as the convoy raced toward the exit of the freight yard, Sarah knew that the worst was yet to come. The convoy's wheels screeched as they tore through the freight yard, their engines roaring against the gathering storm of undead. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The air was thick with tension as the convoy surged forward, the relentless undead closing in from behind. With every turn of the wheels, Sarah pushed herself to stay calm, to keep the survivors focused on the task at hand. The freight yard was a maze of rusted train cars, broken fences, and scattered debris. The space was confined, and the undead had them at a disadvantage. There was no room for error, no time to hesitate. "Keep going!" Sarah shouted over the radio, her voice urgent. "We're almost out." Daniel's voice crackled through the static. "We've got a big group in front. They're blocking the exit." He sounded more worried than she'd ever heard him. "We can't go that way." Sarah's stomach dropped. They were trapped. "We can't afford to stop," she called back, trying to keep her panic in check. "Do you see any other way out?" Daniel scanned the map frantically, his fingers moving over the keyboard. "There's a side gate to the right, but it's farther ahead and barely visible from where we are. It's a gamble, but if we take the risk, it might be our only shot. Everyone, get ready," Sarah commanded. "We're taking the side gate. Follow me." The convoy veered off the main path, heading toward the narrow, almost hidden gate Daniel had spotted. The zombies were close now, their rotting hands reaching out as they groaned hungrily. The survivors could feel the heat of their breath, the terrifying knowledge that they were seconds away from being overwhelmed. The vehicles squeezed through the gap between two towering train cars, their tires scraping against the rusted metal. It was tight, and the sound of metal grinding against metal filled the air, adding to the sense of claustrophobia that already weighed on them. But just as they were about to reach the side gate, a terrifying sound erupted in the distance, the unmistakable screeching of brakes. A loud, hollow crash rang out from somewhere ahead. "Incoming!" Daniel's voice broke through the panic. "A horde's coming in from the other side. They're blocking us in." A massive group of zombies was approaching fast, their numbers swelling as they emerged from the wreckage of the yard. They were everywhere, shambling, twisting, their rotting faces locked in a grotesque expression of hunger. There was no way around them now. Sarah's pulse raced as the convoy came to a screeching halt. The side gate was only a few dozen feet away, but the horde was closing in, and the survivors had nowhere to run. Every passing second felt like an eternity. "We're not going to make it," one of the survivors yelled from the back, his voice breaking with panic. "We are," Sarah shouted, her heart pounding in her chest. "Move! Move!" She slammed her foot on the gas pedal, accelerating toward the gate. The convoy surged forward, and for a moment, it seemed like they might make it. But just as they neared the gate, something unexpected happened. The first vehicle in the convoy collided with the gate's rusted frame, the impact causing a loud, sickening crunch. The survivors winced as the truck's front end buckled under the force. The gate was too old and decayed to withstand the force of the impact, but the convoy couldn't afford to slow down. "Keep pushing!" Sarah screamed, her hands sweating as she fought to steer the vehicle through the wreckage. The gate, though damaged, began to give way. The survivors in the convoy pushed forward, slamming into the decaying metal until, with a final screech, it collapsed. The way out was clear. But as the convoy shot through the opening, the chaos outside was far worse than they could have imagined. A flood of zombies poured in from the other side, attracted by the sound of the gate crashing down. They were fast, too fast, and the survivors barely had time to react. The vehicles surged forward, but the first few survivors were already facing the full brunt of the horde. A couple of vehicles stalled, unable to push through the overwhelming tide of zombies. "Get out!" Sarah yelled, her voice full of panic and urgency. "Everyone, get out now!" The convoy's survivors scrambled to escape the vehicles as they were overrun. The zombies reached for the helpless, tearing at the survivors who weren't fast enough to get to safety. A sense of dread filled the air. Sarah knew that no matter how hard they fought, they were losing ground. Her heart twisted in her chest as she saw survivors being pulled into the dark, their screams fading into the distance. "Daniel!" Sarah called, frantic. "Get out of there! We need to move now!" Daniel was already on the move, his eyes wide with terror. He shoved the laptop into his bag and ran alongside Sarah, who had already unbuckled her seatbelt. The sound of the horde was deafening, and the smell of decay seemed to permeate everything. They couldn't afford to be sentimental about the loss of their vehicles. The only thing that mattered was survival. As Sarah turned to see the last of the survivors making a run for it, she realized just how much they had already lost. The convoy had been reduced in numbers, and the group was now fragmented. Some were still inside their vehicles, trapped by the undead, while others had scattered, trying to find cover in the ruined buildings nearby. "We can't stay here," Sarah said urgently, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to get to the safe zone." But as the survivors ran, they knew that the true fight had only just begun. They had escaped the freight yard, but the price of that escape had been high. Too high. Now, they were exposed, more vulnerable than ever before. The horde was relentless, and the path forward was anything but certain. As they ran, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. They had been fortunate to make it this far, but would their luck hold? Or would the undead soon claim them all, one by one? The unknown stretched out before them, and Sarah realized that their fight for survival was far from over. The survivors stumbled into the wilderness, their bodies aching from the effort of running and the shock of barely escaping the horde. The once bustling freight yard was now a distant nightmare, swallowed by the thick trees and dense underbrush of the wilderness. The sounds of the undead were still faintly echoing in the distance, but the survivors were far enough to have a moment's respite. "Keep moving!" Sarah shouted, her voice hoarse from exertion. "We need to put some distance between us and them." Daniel, who had been at the rear of the group, hurried to catch up, wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked pale, exhausted, but his eyes remained sharp. "They're not far behind," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "We'll have to keep up a steady pace. They can cover ground faster than we can." Great, Sarah muttered under her breath, glancing around the dense forest. The trees, tall and thick, were both a blessing and a curse. They provided cover, but they also hid the danger that could be lurking just out of sight. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, casting the wilderness in an eerie twilight. The moon, barely a sliver in the sky, offered little light. The survivors moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves and underbrush. They didn't speak much, each person lost in their own thoughts as they trudged through the woods. The day's events had left everyone shaken, and the threat of the undead was always looming in the back of their minds. "We need a plan," Daniel said after a long silence, his voice barely audible. He was always the pragmatic one, trying to keep a cool head amidst the chaos. "There's no way we can keep running forever. We need to find somewhere to rest, regroup, and fortify." "I agree," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the dark forest. "But we can't afford to be out in the open for too long. We need a defensible position." "Agreed," Daniel replied, looking around cautiously. "There's an old cabin about a mile east of here. It's off the beaten path, not on any map. But it should be secure for the time being." Sarah considered this for a moment. "A cabin could be our best bet," she said, nodding. "All right, let's head there. But keep your eyes peeled. The last thing we need is to walk into an ambush." The survivors continued through the woods, the dense foliage blocking their view of anything beyond a few feet ahead. The air was thick with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves. In the distance, they could hear the occasional moan of a lone zombie, but it was far enough away not to pose an immediate threat. As they neared the cabin, a sense of relief washed over them. The faint outline of the structure appeared through the trees, an old, weathered building that had seen better days. It was small, with a sagging roof and a porch that had been long since abandoned. But to the survivors, it was a beacon of hope. It offered shelter, a chance to breathe, and perhaps even a fleeting moment of peace. "We made it," Sarah said, almost in disbelief, as they reached the door. Daniel reached for the door handle but hesitated. "Be careful," he warned, his voice low. "We don't know who or what might be inside." With a nod, Sarah motioned for the group to back up slightly. She slowly pushed open the door, her hand steady as she crept inside, eyes scanning every corner for signs of life, or unlife. The cabin was eerily quiet, the only sound the creaking of the old wood beneath their feet. "Clear," Sarah called out after a few tense moments. She stepped inside fully, and the rest of the group followed. The interior was sparse, dust-covered furniture, cobwebs in the corners, and the scent of mildew in the air. But it was dry, sheltered, and secure. For now, it would do. "Get the fire started," Sarah instructed. "We'll need warmth, and we can use it to cook whatever supplies we've got left." The survivors moved quickly, gathering the last of their food and supplies. They set up a small fire in the corner of the cabin, its flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. The survivors sat in a circle, their faces lit by the orange glow. The mood was somber. Despite the relative safety of the cabin, the reality of their situation was sinking in. They had survived the first wave of the horde, but they were still far from safe. The world outside the cabin was a nightmare, and the zombies were relentless. They had escaped the chaos, but for how long? How long before the undead found their way into this isolated refuge? "We'll need to plan our next move," Daniel said, breaking the silence. "We can't stay here forever." Sarah nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. "We need to get to the safe zone," she said. "We have to make contact with the others. There has to be a group out there that's still fighting. We can't let this be the end." "And how do we get there?" one of the survivors, Mark, asked. His voice was tired, his eyes hollow from the exhaustion of the day's events. "We don't have enough supplies, and we can't keep running." Sarah looked around at the group, their faces worn but resolute. She could see the fear in their eyes, but there was also something else, determination. They hadn't come this far just to give up. They had fought their way through unimaginable horrors, and they weren't about to stop now. "We'll make it," Sarah said, her voice steady. We'll keep moving forward. We'll fight together, and we'll find a way out of this." The group nodded, their expressions hardening. The fire crackled in the corner, casting fleeting shadows across the room as the survivors settled into the night, knowing that tomorrow would bring another challenge, another fight for survival. And with that thought, they tried to sleep, though none of them truly rested. They knew that the undead were never far behind, and the wilderness offered little protection. But for tonight, the cabin was theirs. For tonight, they had a chance to regroup, to plan, and to prepare for the next leg of their journey. Tomorrow would be a new day, a day that would bring them one step closer to survival. The morning light filtered weakly through the canopy of trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The survivors woke slowly, their bodies aching and sore from the long night spent in the old cabin. The fire had burned out, leaving only a thin wisp of smoke in the cool air. No one spoke at first, each person lost in their own thoughts, weighed down by the knowledge that survival in this world meant constant vigilance. Sarah stood up, stretching her stiff limbs. The night had passed uneventfully, but she knew that it was only a brief reprieve. They were still in the wilderness, surrounded by the ever-present threat of the undead. The horde that had nearly trapped them in the freight yard could be closing in again at any moment. The safety of the cabin had been temporary, but their journey was far from over. "All right," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "We need to get moving. We're not staying here. The longer we linger, the more we risk attracting unwanted attention." The survivors gathered their things, their faces etched with fatigue but determined to keep going. They had come a long way, and Sarah wasn't about to let them fall apart now. Daniel stepped forward, holding up a crude map. "We've got two options. We can head south toward the abandoned military outpost, about 10 miles away. It's a long shot, but it's our best chance for finding weapons and supplies. Or, we can try to link up with any survivor groups that might be to the north. Both routes are dangerous, but I think the south route gives us a better chance of finding more survivors or some kind of safe zone." Sarah studied the map, her finger tracing the two potential paths. Both were fraught with peril, and neither promised safety. The wilderness was a maze, and the undead were everywhere. But they had no other choice. "We'll take the south route," Sarah decided. "We don't have time to waste. We need weapons, and we need to keep moving." The survivors nodded, packing up their meager supplies. They didn't have much, just the essentials: water, some canned food, and a few makeshift weapons. There was no time to be picky, no time for luxury. They were fighting for their lives, and every step forward was a risk. As they left the cabin behind and ventured deeper into the wilderness, the air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around them. The thick underbrush slowed their progress, and the sense of being hunted was palpable. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig beneath their feet, made their hearts race with anticipation. They moved quietly, as stealthily as possible, but Sarah knew that the undead could hear them, smell them, even from a distance. The whole forest felt like a ticking time bomb, ready to go off at any moment. "How much farther?" Mark asked, his voice tired but still laced with determination. He was one of the stronger survivors, but even he was feeling the strain of the journey. "It's about a 3-hour hike, if we don't run into too much trouble," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the nerves gnawing at her insides. "We keep moving, keep our heads down, and we'll make it." The group pushed on, taking breaks only when necessary. The silence of the wilderness was deafening, and the only sounds were their own footsteps and the occasional distant groan of the undead. But they didn't let up, no one spoke unless absolutely necessary. They knew that noise would attract attention. As they neared a clearing, Sarah held up her hand, signaling the group to stop. They all froze, their eyes scanning the surroundings. A figure emerged from the trees ahead, slowly and cautiously. At first, it seemed like a survivor, but as the person came into view, Sarah's heart sank. The figure was covered in dirt, blood streaking their clothes, and their eyes were wild, desperate. They staggered forward, half collapsed on the ground. The survivors instinctively backed away, raising their weapons in defense. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This person looked like they had been through hell, but it was the way they moved, the way they seemed almost too stiff. "Stay back," Daniel shouted, his voice sharp. "That person could be infected." The figure jerked to a stop, a twisted expression crossing their face. They looked up, their eyes wild with terror, and then their lips parted, revealing a mouth full of rotting teeth. "Help me," the person gasped, their voice a hoarse whisper. "Please, they're coming." Before Sarah could react, the figure lunged forward, faster than she anticipated. A sickening growl erupted from the person's throat, and they reached for her with gnarled hands. "Get down!" Sarah shouted, pushing the nearest survivor out of the way. The person's body was already starting to change. The familiar, horrifying transformation of someone infected with the virus was taking hold. Their skin was decaying, their movements erratic and jerky. Without hesitation, Daniel swung his bat, connecting with the person's skull. The blow echoed through the clearing, and the figure dropped to the ground, lifeless once more. "That was too close," Sarah said, panting. Her heart was pounding in her chest. "We need to be more careful. The infected are everywhere." The survivors stood in tense silence, the reality of the situation sinking in. They had just encountered a person who was still in the early stages of infection, someone who had clearly been trying to survive but had been overtaken by the virus. The thought that they might be next, that any of them could fall to the same fate, was too much to bear. "We can't trust anyone we meet out here," Sarah said grimly. "Not anymore." The group nodded, the weight of her words settling over them. The world they had known was gone, replaced by a harsh, unforgiving wilderness. Survival was a constant battle, and no one could afford to let their guard down. With that chilling realization, they turned back to their journey, moving deeper into the wilderness, knowing that they would face more dangers before they could ever hope to find safety. The hunt had begun, not just for food or supplies, but for their very lives. And every step they took brought them closer to either victory or death. The survivors pushed onward, each step forward a struggle as the oppressive weight of the wilderness pressed down on them. Hours passed, and fatigue settled into their bones like a heavy cloak. Despite the sense of urgency that had driven them forward, Sarah could feel the weariness creeping in, affecting not just their physical stamina but their mental resilience. The world around them had become a constant reminder that they were alone in a world overrun by the undead, fighting to stay alive. The sun had risen high in the sky, its light filtering weakly through the dense trees. The forest, once a place of beauty and refuge, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and uncertainty. Each rustling leaf, each distant growl of the undead, sent shivers down their spines. "We need a rest," Daniel said, his voice tight with exhaustion. "We've been going non-stop. We're going to wear ourselves out." Sarah hesitated. The thought of stopping was tempting, but every moment spent in one place was a moment closer to being discovered by the horde. Yet, Daniel had a point. They couldn't afford to keep pushing themselves without a break. "We'll stop here," Sarah said reluctantly, her voice low. "But we'll keep watch. No one relaxes too much." They found a small clearing nestled between a few thick trees. It was concealed enough to provide some cover from the open wilderness, but it didn't offer much protection. The survivors set up their makeshift camp as best as they could, gathering what little shelter the trees offered. The group gathered in a huddle, sitting close together for warmth and protection. They ate what little food they had left, canned beans, some stale crackers, and the last of the water supply. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them through the next few hours. The hunger gnawed at them, but they kept their focus. They had bigger problems to worry about than their empty stomachs. As they sat in silence, their thoughts were interrupted by the sound of distant footsteps. A quick glance between them was all it took for Sarah to raise her hand, signaling for everyone to freeze. "Someone's coming," she whispered. "Stay still." The survivors fell silent, holding their breath. The sound of footsteps grew closer, and then, to their shock, a voice, a familiar voice, cut through the quiet. "Sarah? Is that you?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice. It was unmistakable. "Tom," she called out cautiously, stepping forward. Her eyes scanned the trees nervously, not entirely sure whether she was hearing things or if it was truly him. She had to be careful, anyone could be infected. But that voice, it was a voice she hadn't heard in what felt like years. Out of the shadows stepped a man, his face gaunt and worn with the passage of time, but unmistakably Tom. His hair was longer, unkempt, and there was a wildness in his eyes, but it was him. The man who had been her best friend before the world had turned upside down. "Sarah," Tom said with a grin, relief washing over his face. "I can't believe it. I thought you were dead, all of you. Where are the others?" Sarah took a step back, still unsure of what to believe. There was a faint odor of decay about him, a slight stench in the air that made her stomach turn. His clothes were ragged, stained with dirt and blood, and his hands trembled slightly. "Tom, what happened to you?" Sarah asked, her voice cautious. "How are you even alive?" Tom's smile faltered. I've been surviving, just like you. I thought I was alone. Then I found a group, and we tried to rebuild. But..." His eyes darted around the group, his expression darkening. "It all fell apart. People turned. There was a betrayal. Things got ugly." He fell silent for a moment, his gaze distant, as if reliving the horrors he had witnessed. Sarah and the others exchanged wary glances. There was something in Tom's eyes, something off, like he was hiding something. "Where's this group you were with?" Daniel asked, his tone sharp, his eyes fixed on Tom. "What happened to them?" Tom shifted uncomfortably, his fingers fidgeting. "They didn't make it. I'm the only one left." Sarah took another step toward him, her instincts telling her to be careful, to question every word. The man she once knew seemed different, broken, haunted. But at the same time, he was offering them a glimmer of hope. If he was telling the truth, they could be the link to a larger survivor group, a place that might offer shelter or a way out of this nightmare. "Where were you headed?" Sarah pressed. "We're trying to find the military outpost to the south. Can you help us get there?" Tom's eyes darkened. "I wouldn't go there if I were you," he said, his voice low. "I've heard rumors. The military isn't what it used to be. They might be as dangerous as the undead. And I'm not sure I can trust anyone anymore. They have secrets, things they didn't tell me." "Secrets?" Sarah repeated, her voice tinged with suspicion. "What kind of secrets?" Tom hesitated, his gaze shifting nervously toward the trees. "I can't explain everything, but you're all better off staying away from there. There's something about the military, something that doesn't sit right with me. They may have caused all of this. They might be the reason this world is the way it is." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Sarah's mind raced. Could the military be responsible for the outbreak? Could their efforts to stop the undead have only made things worse? It was a theory they had never considered, one that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone still alive. "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with frustration. "Where do we go from here? You can't just drop a bombshell like that and leave us hanging." Tom's eyes flickered, and for a moment, he seemed almost apologetic. "I don't have all the answers," he said quietly. "But I can show you where a group of survivors is hiding out. We'll be safe there. It's a long shot, but it's better than wandering the wilderness without a plan." The survivors exchanged glances. The possibility of a safe place was too tempting to ignore. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Tom wasn't telling them the whole truth. There was something he was holding back, and it made her uneasy. Despite her doubts, she nodded. "All right. Lead the way." With that, the survivors followed Tom, knowing that the road ahead was even more uncertain than they had anticipated. The military, the rumors, and the truth about what really happened to the world were all pieces of the puzzle that they needed to solve. But for now, survival came first. They would follow Tom, hoping he wasn't leading them into another trap. The survivors moved with renewed urgency, following Tom through the dense forest. The tension among the group was palpable, and every rustle of leaves seemed amplified, every shadow darker than before. Despite the promise of safety in the form of a survivor group, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging doubt that Tom wasn't telling them everything. The truth about the military and the secrets he hinted at weighed heavily on her mind. As they trekked deeper into the wilderness, the days began to blend together. Exhaustion, hunger, and fear pushed them all to their limits. But they had no choice. The only way forward was through the forest, and they trusted Tom, at least for now. Hours passed, and the thick trees eventually began to thin out. The landscape opened up to reveal a clearing. In the distance, Sarah could make out a series of makeshift structures, tents, barriers, and a large campfire in the center. A few figures moved around the camp, their movements cautious, as if they were just as wary of outsiders as Sarah's group was of them. "This is it," Tom said, his voice almost a whisper. "This is where they've been hiding." The survivors exchanged nervous glances. The sight of the camp was both a relief and a source of unease. Could this truly be a safe haven, or was it yet another dangerous trap? They approached cautiously, keeping their weapons close but not raised. Sarah, leading the group, kept her eyes locked on the figures in the camp as they grew closer. It was then that one of them, a tall man with a grizzled beard, stepped forward. His eyes were tired but alert, scanning the newcomers. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice rough but not unfriendly. He looked past Sarah and directly at Tom. "Tom, is that you? We thought you were dead." "I'm not dead," Tom replied with a half-smile, though there was an edge of tension in his voice. "I've got company. They need help." The man's gaze shifted to Sarah and the others. His expression hardened slightly, but he didn't draw his weapon. "What's your business here?" "We're survivors," Sarah said quickly, stepping forward. "We've been traveling for days. We heard there might be a safe place here. We've been through hell trying to survive." The man looked them over, studying their weary faces. He seemed to weigh the situation in his mind before nodding, though his weariness didn't dissipate. "We don't let just anyone in. There's been too much trouble with outsiders recently." "We understand," Sarah said, keeping her tone calm and respectful. "We're not looking to cause any problems. We just need a place to rest, to regroup. We've been fighting the undead in the wilderness. We don't have anywhere else to go." The man's eyes flickered to Tom once more. "All right, fine. You can stay for now. But if you step out of line, if you attract any trouble," he didn't finish the sentence, letting the unspoken threat hang in the air. "We'll stay out of your way," Sarah promised, nodding firmly. "Thank you." The man motioned for them to follow, and they entered the camp. As they moved through the small settlement, Sarah couldn't help but notice the signs of desperation. The people here were survivors, but they looked exhausted. Many were injured, and there were only a few guards posted around the perimeter. It was a far cry from the safety they had hoped for. They were led to a cluster of tents near the center of the camp, where Sarah and the others were offered food and water. It wasn't much, simple rations, but it was enough to quiet their gnawing hunger. As they ate, Sarah looked around, watching the other survivors. Some were talking quietly, while others kept to themselves, their eyes filled with the same weariness she had seen in her own group. Suddenly, a sharp, frantic shout cut through the air, followed by the unmistakable growl of the undead. The camp immediately erupted into chaos. People scrambled to their feet, grabbing weapons and rushing to the barricades. The sound of guttural growls grew louder, and Sarah's heart raced. "Stay down!" Tom shouted, grabbing her arm as he pulled her into the safety of a nearby tent. "It's happening again." Outside, the camp was in full-blown panic. The undead had found them. In an instant, the security of their sanctuary was shattered, and the survivors were fighting for their lives. "They were right," Sarah muttered under her breath. "We never should have trusted this place." But there was no time to dwell on regrets. She could hear the screams of other survivors outside, and the sound of fists meeting flesh. The undead had broken through the perimeter. "We need to help them," Daniel said, his voice urgent. He was already standing, his weapon in hand. If we don't fight back, this whole camp's going to fall. No, Sarah said, gripping his arm. We need to get out of here. This place isn't safe. But before she could protest further, a loud crash echoed from the other side of the camp, and the undead swarmed through a gap in the barricades. Sarah's group, now fully alert and prepared for battle, rushed into the fray. They fought side by side with the other survivors, using every ounce of energy they had left to push back the horde. The battle was chaotic. The undead were everywhere, relentless and insatiable. The survivors fought with desperation, but it quickly became clear that they were outnumbered. Sarah moved quickly, swinging her weapon at the closest zombie, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Mark fought beside her, his fists connecting with the skull of an infected that had lunged at him. Despite their efforts, the odds were against them. The undead pressed forward, forcing the survivors to retreat deeper into the camp. It wasn't long before Sarah realized that the camp had fallen. The once haven had turned into a war zone, the campfires now smoldering ruins in the distance. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah grabbed Tom. Where do we go? What do we do now? Tom's face was grim, his eyes reflecting the horror around them. We keep moving. There's a place, a backup, nearby. But we have to go now. There's no time to waste. The group, battered and broken, made their way out of the camp, running through the woods once more. They had learned a harsh lesson: no place was safe. No group could be trusted entirely. As they fled into the darkness, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, if the world was truly this lost, was there any hope left at all? The struggle wasn't over. It had only just begun.